1940, the Nazis believed they were invincible. Their detection technology was laughed at by Allied scientists, but they missed one tiny device that would cost them the war. The Battle of Britain wasn't just won by pilots, it was almost lost because of a fatal flaw in detection, until a small, unassuming box, the Tizard Magnetron, changed everything. We all know the names of the generals and the battles, but the man who truly saved Britain, Henry Tizard, isn't in most history books, and the Nazis laughed at his invention until it was too late. It is difficult, perhaps, for us today to truly grasp the darkness of 1940. We live in a world of instant information where satellites watch every corner of the globe, but in that desperate summer, Britain stood alone, and it was blind. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water that had held Napoleon at bay, suddenly seemed no wider than a river. The German war machine, the most terrifying military force the world had ever seen, had crushed Poland, swallowed France, and pushed the British Army into the sea at Dunkirk. Now it paused, gathering its strength for the final blow. Hermann Göring, the arrogant head of the Luftwaffe, promised the German people that he would wipe the Royal Air Force from the sky, and then he would level London. And every night, the air raid sirens began their mournful wail, the sound of the Blitz. It was a sound of pure cold dread. Families huddled in Anderson shelters in their backyards or deep in the London Underground, listening to the rumble of Heinkel and Dornier bombers passing overhead. They listened for the whistle of a falling bomb, a sound that, if you heard it, meant it wasn't meant for you. The problem was not just the bombs, it was the helplessness. The British pilots, the heroic young men of the RAF, were fighting with incredible courage, but they were fighting a ghost. The Luftwaffe owned the night. The existing defenses were relics of a bygone era. On the coasts of Kent, giant concrete sound mirrors, massive dishes carved from stone, were pointed toward France. They were designed to catch the distant thrum of an approaching engine and give a few minutes of warning. They were ingenious in a 19th century way, but by 1940 they were hopelessly obsolete. The new bombers were simply too fast. By the time the sound reached the mirrors, the bombs were already falling. This was the technology the Nazis laughed at, and frankly, they had a point. Britain's real shield was a secret, a fragile network of towers along the coast called Chain Home. This was the world's first integrated radar system. It could see approaching planes from 100 miles away. It was a miracle of science, and it was the single reason the RAF was able to meet the German daytime raids. Without Chain Home, the Battle of Britain would have been lost in a week, but it had a fatal flaw. Chain Home was a floodlight. It could tell you that something was coming and roughly from where, but it couldn't pinpoint a single aircraft. It was excellent for broad strategic warning, but it was useless for guiding a night fighter to a kill, or for telling a gun crew on the ground where to aim. The resolution was measured in miles. The Germans, meanwhile, were not just bombing blindly, they had their own dark magic. The British discovered, to their horror, that German bombers were flying along focused radio beams like a digital highway in the sky. This system, codenamed Knickebein or kinked leg, guided them directly to their targets. They didn't need to see London. They just needed to listen for a signal in their headphones. When the signal from one beam was met by a crossbeam, the bombardier released his payload. It was precise, it was sinister, and it was devastating Coventry. This discovery triggered a desperate, secret conflict known as the Battle of the Beams. A brilliant young scientist named R.V. Jones, barely 30 years old, was tasked with figuring out this German technology and, more importantly, how to break it. Jones was a genius, a man who saw patterns no one else did. He deduced the existence of the beams from a few cryptic pieces of intelligence. His team then scrambled to build transmitters that would bend the German beams or broadcast false signals, making the bombs fall harmlessly in empty fields. It was a war of electrons, fought in total silence.
And it was a partial victory, but it only solved half the problem. Jamming the beams was defense. It didn't help Britain fight back. It didn't help the gunners on the ground who were firing thousands of shells for every one plane they hit, mostly by luck. The calculations for hitting a moving target 3 miles up, moving at hundreds of miles an hour, in total darkness, were simply beyond human capability. The gun crews needed eyes. The night fighters needed eyes. And the eyes they had were failing. This was the technological wall. This was the moment where the war and the fate of the free world rested not on the generals, but on a small group of quiet, worried scientists. We often think of history as being shaped by loud voices and grand gestures, by men like Winston Churchill, whose words could rally a nation. But the truth is, the most important decisions are often made in quiet rooms by men whose names are rarely remembered. Such a man was Henry Tizard. Tizard was not a politician. He was a chemist, a pilot from the Great War, and a rector at Imperial College. He was a practical, methodical man who believed in data, in experiments, and in what worked. He had little patience for grandstanding or theoretical daydreams, and in 1934, long before the war, he was the man who chaired the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense. It was this committee that had championed radar in the first place, pushing for the development of chain home against massive institutional skepticism. Tizard was the man who believed that the next war would be won not by battleships, but by electrons. He was, in essence, the father of British air defense science. But Tizard had a rival, a man who would become a thorn in his side and who represented a completely different approach to science and war. That man was Frederick Lindemann, a physicist at Oxford, known to his friends as the Prof. Lindemann was brilliant, there was no doubt, but he was also arrogant, secretive, and deeply political. And he had one crucial advantage over Tizard. He was Winston Churchill's closest personal friend and scientific advisor. Where Tizard was collaborative, Lindemann was territorial. Where Tizard trusted experimental data, Lindemann trusted his own complex and often flawed calculations. When Churchill became prime minister in 1940, Lindemann's power soared. He and Tizard clashed constantly. Lindemann pushed for his own pet projects, ideas that Tizard and his committee viewed as bordering on fantasy. He wanted to drop aerial mines, tiny bombs on parachutes, in the path of German bomber formations. He advocated for filling the skies with cables suspended from balloons. He even had calculations for dropping bombs made of vegetable materials, believing they would have some special, undefined effect. Tizard, looking at the same data, saw these as disastrous wastes of precious time and resources. He knew the aerial mines wouldn't work. The chances of a bomber actually hitting one were astronomically small. He knew the real solution, the only solution, was better radar. This was not just a professional disagreement, it became a bitter personal feud. It was a battle for the soul of British war science, and it was a battle Tizard was beginning to lose. Lindemann, with Churchill's ear, had Tizard's original committee disbanded, effectively sidelining him. But Tizard knew he was right. The problem was clear. Chain-Home's radar waves were simply too long. At a wavelength of 10 meters, the signal was a blunt instrument. To get the kind of precision needed for a gun-laying radar, or a radar small enough to fit in the nose of a night fighter, you needed to shorten the wavelength dramatically. You needed to get down to the centimetric range, just 10 centimeters or less. This was the realm of microwaves. And in 1940, generating high-power microwaves was considered science fiction. The best device they had was called a klystron. It was a clever American invention, but it was fundamentally weak. It could produce microwaves, yes, but with all the power of a dim flashlight. The Tizard-backed scientists needed a searchlight. They needed to increase the power output not by 10% or even 100%, but by a factor of 1,000. The Germans, for their part, had also looked at microwave radar and dismissed it. Their scientists concluded it was a dead end. The generating that much power at such a high frequency was impossible under the laws of physics as they understood them. This was the core of their arrogance. This was why they laughed. They believed they had hit the same technological wall, and since they couldn't solve it, no one could. This is where the story shifts from the halls of power in London to a modest laboratory at the University of Birmingham. Two men, John Randall and Harry Boot, were tasked by Tizard's group to work on this impossible problem. They weren't famous physicists, they were junior researchers. They were given the klystron to see if they could improve it. They looked at it and, like everyone else, saw it was a dead end. Its design was just too limited. So they decided to try something completely different.
Randall remembered an old, obscure concept from his studies, the idea of a cavity resonator. Think of it like a whistle. When you blow over the top of a bottle, you get a pure, clear note. The size and shape of the bottle, the cavity, determines the frequency. What if, Randall thought, they could do the same thing with electrons? What if instead of one bottle, they used a block of copper with several bottles or cavities drilled into it? And what if instead of blowing air, they fired a stream of electrons past these cavities, controlled by a powerful magnet? The theory was simple, almost elegant. As the electrons streamed past the cavities, they would make them sing or resonate at a very specific, very high microwave frequency. And because all the cavities were singing in perfect time, their power would add up. It was a completely new design. They had no idea if it would work. In November 1939, they began to build it. Their university, like all of Britain, was short on everything. They built their first prototype in the university workshop. It was a squat cylinder of solid copper, about 4 inches across, with 6 cavities drilled into it. It was crude. They didn't have the proper vacuum seals, so they used ordinary sealing wax, the kind you'd use on a letter. On February 21, 1940, they were ready for the first test. The device sat on a wooden table, hooked up to a tangle of wires, magnets, and power supplies. They turned it on. The power meters, designed to measure the weak output of a klystron, immediately slammed to their maximum reading, the needles bending. Randall and Boot thought their equipment was broken. They brought in more robust equipment. They tested it again. The results were not just good. They were unbelievable. The device, which they called the cavity magnetron, was producing 400 watts of power at a 10-centimeter wavelength. It wasn't 1,000 times more powerful than the klystron. It was 10,000 times more powerful. And it was tiny. It could fit in the palm of your hand. They had not just climbed the wall the Germans thought was unclimbable, they had blasted a hole through it with dynamite. This small wax-sealed lump of copper was the single most important invention of the Second World War. It was the device that would shatter the Luftwaffe. But in February 1940, it was just a fragile, miraculous device in a university lab. It was a long way from being a weapon, and Britain was running out of time. As Randall and Boot refined their device, the world outside their lab was collapsing. In May, the Blitzkrieg smashed into France. In June, Dunkirk. Britain was bracing for invasion. The leadership was desperate. It was in this atmosphere of sheer panic that Henry Tizard made his most important and perhaps most controversial decision. He realized that Britain, even with the magnetron, might not survive. The country lacked the industrial might, the resources, and the time to turn this lab miracle into a weapon quickly enough. If Britain fell, this secret, the key to winning the war, would fall with it. It had to be shared. Tizard proposed a radical idea: give it all away. Give Britain's most precious secrets, including the Magnetron, to the one nation that had the industrial power to mass produce it, the United States. This was a tremendous gamble. America was still neutral. Many in the U.S. wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. Giving away your crown jewels to a neutral party was an act of profound faith or profound desperation. Churchill, urged on by Lindemann, was initially skeptical. Lindemann didn't trust the Americans, and more to the point, he didn't trust Tizard. But Tizard, with his calm, rational persistence, eventually won the argument. In the late summer of 1940, the Tizard Mission was approved. Tizard himself would lead a small team of scientists to America. They carried with them a single, locked wooden box designated number 10. Inside this black box was the entire portfolio of British scientific secrets, blueprints for jet engines, advances in explosives, research on the atomic bomb, and nestled in the center, a single, precious cavity magnetron. The mission traveled in total secrecy. Tizard and his team knew that if their ship was sunk by a U-boat or their plane shot down, the war might be lost. The value in that box was literally priceless. When they arrived in Washington, D.C., they were met with a polite but slightly skeptical reception. The Americans had their own scientists, organized under the new National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC, led by visionaries like Vannevar Bush and Carl Compton. They were proud of their own work, particularly their radar. Tizard and his team met with the Americans in a secure room. The Americans showed their best radar. It was good, but it was still based on the old low-frequency technology. Then Tizard's man, Taffy Bowen, opened the black box. He placed the small copper magnetron on the table. The Americans looked at it, confused. It looked like a paperweight. Bowen explained what it was, a device that could generate tens of kilowatts of power at a 10-centimeter wavelength. The Americans in the room were silent. They were, to put it mildly, stunned. They knew instantly what this meant. One of the American scientists later said that moment was like being handed the keys to the kingdom. The Americans had been struggling with the exact same problem. Their best device produced maybe 20 watts. The British had brought them a device that produced over 10,000 watts. The Americans immediately took the magnetron to their own elite research center, Bell Telephone Laboratories. They hooked it up to their own equipment, still half believing it was some kind of trick. They turned it on. The power was so intense it lit up a rack of fluorescent light bulbs held nearby, with no wires attached.
That was the moment. The laughing had officially stopped. The American scientist, Vannevar Bush, later said the cavity magnetron was the most valuable cargo ever to reach our shores. Within days, a decision was made. America would pour its limitless industrial and scientific resources into weaponizing this device. A new top-secret laboratory was created specifically for this purpose. It was called the MIT Radiation Laboratory, or the Rad Lab. It would become the single most important and least known weapons development center of the war, even more so, in many ways, than the Manhattan Project, because its inventions would be used to win the war, not just end it. The MIT Rad Lab was a remarkable place. It grew from a handful of physicists and a borrowed office to a staff of nearly 4,000. It was a collection of the brightest minds in America, physicists, engineers, and mathematicians, all driven by a single urgent goal. That goal was to turn the Tizard magnetron into a weapon that could be mass-produced and used in the field. The place hummed with an intellectual energy that was almost frantic. They knew they were in a race against time. The Rad Lab immediately split into several groups, each tackling a different part of the problem. Project 1 was to create an airborne radar, a radar small enough to fit in a bomber to find targets on the ground, and small enough to fit in a fighter to find other planes in the sky. This led to the H-2S system, which gave Allied bombers the ability to see cities like Hamburg and Berlin through solid cloud cover.
This was a revolutionary offensive tool. If you find this kind of hidden history as fascinating as we do, we post news stories like this every week. Many viewers tell us they subscribe to the channel just so they don't miss the next chapter. But our story today focuses on Project 2. This was, in many ways, the Holy Grail. It was the defensive weapon Tizard had dreamed of, a gun-laying radar. The challenge was immense. It wasn't enough to just see a plane. A bullet or an artillery shell takes time to travel. If you aim your gun directly at the plane, by the time the shell gets there, the plane will be long gone. You have to aim at a patch of empty sky in front of the plane. This is called lead. For centuries, gunners had to calculate this in their heads. It was guesswork, instinct, and a lot of luck. By WWII, they had mechanical gun directors like the American M4. An operator would try to track the plane by turning two crank handles, one for altitude and one for direction. This mechanical device would then try to compute the lead, but it was slow, clumsy, and hideously inaccurate. The operators were human. They'd get tired. They'd flinch. The target was a fast-moving speck. The system was failing. The Rad Lab team knew they needed to build something entirely new, a system that didn't just help the human, but replace the human's weakest links. This system, which would become the legendary SCR-584, was not a single invention. It was a revolutionary integration of 4, and later 5, breakthrough technologies. Each one was a miracle in itself. The first component, of course, was the Tizard Magnetron. This was the eyes of the system. Its 10-centimeter wavelength was so short and so powerful that it could paint a picture of the sky with unbelievable clarity. It didn't see a blip the size of a city block. It saw a blip the size of a single aircraft. But just seeing it wasn't enough. You had to follow it. This led to the second invention, automatic tracking. The existing radars required an operator to stare at a screen and keep the target centered by hand. The Rad Lab engineers developed a system called helical scanning. The radar beam itself would spin in a tiny, tight circle. If the target was perfectly in the center, the signal echo would be steady. But if the target moved even slightly off-center, the spinning beam would produce a different signal as it passed over it. An operator could see this error on a simple screen and just nudge his controls to recenter it. This was good, but they took it one step further. They made the radar aim itself. The error signal from the helical scan was fed directly to electric motors on the radar dish. The dish would automatically move to keep the target locked perfectly in the center. The operator's new job was just to find the target and say, "Lock on." The SCR-584 would then follow that plane across the sky with a terrifying, relentless, inhuman precision. The third invention was the brain. Now that the radar had a perfect, continuous stream of data on the plane's position, speed, and direction, that data had to be crunched. This job fell to Bell Laboratories, who were working in parallel with the Rad Lab. They created the M9 Director. This was a suitcase-sized analog computer. It was a marvel of gears, motors, and electronic circuits. It took the raw data from the SCR-584, and in real time, it performed the complex trigonometry. It calculated the plane's future position. It factored in the wind speed, the temperature, the air density, and even the drift of the artillery shell as it flew. And it did this not once, but continuously, updating its solution many times every second. It was a mechanical brain dedicated to a single task, solving the lead angle problem.
The fourth invention was the muscle. The M9 computer had the answer. It knew exactly where the gun needed to point. But how do you tell the gun? A 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun is a massive piece of steel. It weighs several tons. The shells alone weighed over 20 pounds. You couldn't just have a man with a crank handle trying to follow the frantic, precise commands of the M9. So, the system was given hydraulic and electric motors, directly slaved to the M9 computer. The gun aimed itself. This was the revolution. The SCR-584 was the first truly automated point-and-shoot weapon system in history.
The human operators were now managers, not participants. One man found the target on the radar scope, another gave the lock-on command, and a third team just kept feeding shells into the breech of the gun. The radar found the target, the M9 computer aimed the gun, and the hydraulic motors moved it. All the human error, the panic, the guesswork, and the fatigue was gone. It was replaced by the cold, fast, and deadly precision of a machine. This entire system, from a laboratory concept to a field-ready unit, was developed in just under 2 years. It was an industrial and scientific achievement that even today is staggering. The Nazis had laughed because they thought the problem was impossible. The Allies, fueled by Tizard's Magnetron and American industrial power, had not just solved it, they had mastered it. The weapon was ready, and it was about to be unleashed on an unsuspecting Luftwaffe. The first true test of the SCR-584 came in early 1944 at the Anzio beachhead in Italy. The Allies had landed, but they were pinned down, their ships and supplies vulnerable to constant Luftwaffe air attack. The German pilots were experienced, and they knew how to dodge the old, inaccurate flak. They would come in fast and low, drop their bombs, and be gone before the gunners on the ground could even react. It was a slaughter. Then, the new SCR-584 units were quietly brought ashore and set up. The next time the Luftwaffe came, the world changed. The American gun crews simply locked on to the incoming planes, the M9 computers spun to life, the 90mm guns swung silently, seemingly of their own accord, and began to fire. German planes, which had been flying with impunity, suddenly began to explode in midair. One after another, they were swatted from the sky. The German pilots were in a state of sheer panic. They couldn't understand what was happening. They were dodging, weaving, but the shells were following them. They reported back to their bases that the Allies had a new, terrifying weapon. They called it flak with brains. The effect was not just physical, it was psychological. The Luftwaffe crews, who were already stretched thin by 1944, simply stopped attacking Anzio. The risk was too high. The new radar had created a no-fly zone over the Allied beachhead. It had worked beyond Tizard's wildest dreams. But its greatest test, the battle that would truly vindicate Tizard and his Magnetron, was yet to come. It would be fought not in Italy, but over the skies of London itself. In June 1944, just days after D-Day, Hitler unleashed his new vengeance weapon, the V1, the Vergeltungswaffe 1. The British public came to know it by a more familiar, chilling name, the buzz bomb, or the Doodlebug. This was a completely new kind of terror. It was not a plane, but a small, pilotless jet. It was, in effect, the world's first cruise missile. It was launched from ramps in France, flew at 400 miles per hour, and carried a 1-ton warhead. Its little pulse jet engine made a unique, sputtering, buzzing sound that Londoners came to dread. The worst part of the V1 was its psychology. The buzz bomb would fly over the city, and as long as you could hear it, you were safe. The terror came when the engine cut out. This meant the V1 had run out of fuel and was beginning its final silent dive. Somewhere below, in the next 10 to 15 seconds, a city block would be erased. The V1 offensive was a desperate, spiteful act of a losing regime designed to break the will of the British people. And, at first, it worked. The defenses were powerless. The V1 was too fast for most fighters of the day to catch, and it was too small and fast for the old M4 gun directors to track. In the first week of the attack, the anti-aircraft guns fired 24,000 shells and shot down only 100 buzz bombs. It was a failure rate of over 99%. The public was panicked and morale was plummeting. This was a crisis. This was the moment for the SCR-584. In a frantic effort, the entire Allied command structure was retasked. General Frederick Peel, the head of the Anti-Aircraft Command, ordered every single SCR-584 unit in Britain and many from the continent to be moved to the coast. They created a massive diver belt, a line of radar-guided guns along the cliffs of Dover designed to intercept the V1s as they flew over the channel before they reached London. But even the SCR-584, as brilliant as it was,
had a problem. It was accurate, but the V-1 was a small target. A near miss was still a miss. The gun crews needed one final piece of the puzzle, and by incredible historical timing, that piece had just become available. It was the other great secret of the war, the proximity fuse.
For years, scientists at Johns Hopkins University in America had been working on a fuse, a detonator for an artillery shell that was itself a tiny radar. Imagine a complete radar set with a transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch shell and rugged enough to survive being fired from a cannon with a force of 20,000 Gs. This tiny device would send out its own radio waves. When it detected an object near it, like the metal skin of an airplane, it would complete the circuit and detonate the shell. The shell no longer needed a direct hit. It just had to get close. The lethal radius of a 90mm shell instantly expanded from a few feet to over 70 feet. The proximity fuse was the fifth and final piece of the system. The SCR-584 was the eyes. The M9 director was the brain. The 90mm gun was the muscle. And the proximity fuse was the fist. This was the completed kill chain. The new fuses were rushed to the diver belt in July 1944. The results were immediate and astounding. The gun crews, now equipped with the full system, began to slaughter the V-1s over the English Channel. The kill statistics, which the military tracked obsessively, tell the whole story. In the first week of the new deployment, the SCR-584s with their new fuses shot down 24% of all V-1s that entered their zone. The next week, the rate climbed to 46%. The week after, 60%. By the last week of August, the guns were destroying 79% of all incoming buzz bombs. On the final day of the V-1 offensive, before the launch sites were overrun by the advancing Allied armies, 104 V-1s were launched at London. The guns of the diver belt shot down 101 of them. The V-1 threat was over. The city of London had been saved. It was a victory of technology, of systems, and of the quiet, persistent vision of Henry Tizard. His Magnetron had proven itself. The laughter of the Nazis had been silenced, replaced by the stunned realization that they were fighting an enemy who could see in the dark. This revolution was not confined to the cliffs of Dover. The SCR-584 systems were deployed to the European continent after D-Day. They followed the advancing armies of Patton and Bradley, creating a protective umbrella over troops, bridges, and supply depots. The effect on the Luftwaffe was final. German pilots, who were already outnumbered and outgunned, now faced an enemy that was automated and infallible. To fly a mission against an Allied position protected by the SCR-584 was quite simply suicide. They stopped flying. By the Battle of the Bulge, the Luftwaffe was a broken force, its few remaining pilots terrified to engage. The Allies had achieved total, complete, and undisputed air supremacy. This was the end of the air war. The story of the Magnetron is the story of a war won not just by courage, but by intellect. It's a story of how one man's quiet insistence on a difficult scientific truth, Henry Tizard, proved itself more powerful than the political maneuvering of his rival, Lindemann. After the war, Lindemann's pet projects, the aerial mines and the rest, were proven to be total failures. Tizard's Magnetron was proven to be the single most decisive piece of technology of the entire conflict. And it's a story that reaches far beyond the 1940s. The SCR-584 was the ancestor of every modern air defense system, the basis for the Patriot missile systems we see today. The principles of the M9 analog computer laid the groundwork for the digital computers that would follow. And that little copper block, the cavity magnetron, found a second, more peaceful life. The Rad Lab was dismantled, but one of its engineers, a man named Percy Spencer, was standing next to a running magnetron one day and noticed the chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. From that accidental discovery came the microwave oven. Every time you heat up a cup of coffee, you are using a direct descendant of the device that saved London. If you've ever flown in a plane, the air traffic control radar that guided you safely
is a descendant of the Tizard Magnetron. The world we live in, a world connected and protected by invisible waves, was born in that desperate summer of 1940. It was a victory of humility over hubris, of science over dogma. The Nazis laughed at a technology they didn't understand, but it was Henry Tizard, his team, and their American partners who had the last laugh, a laugh that echoed from the cliffs of Dover to the ruins of Berlin. It's a powerful lesson in never underestimating the power of a new idea. We spend a lot of time on this channel digging into these forgotten stories, the details that the history books often miss. If you believe this kind of history matters, the best way to support this work is to share this video with a friend, a family member, or on a forum where people still appreciate these kinds of stories. It helps more than you know. The legacy of the SCR-584 is a testament to what can be accomplished when ingenuity is backed by resolve. It's a story of how a small group of scientists, facing an impossible problem, created a solution that not only won a war, but reshaped our entire world. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bigger bomb, but a clearer set of eyes. If you'd like to see more, we've got another video queued up about a different secret weapon from the war that you've probably never heard of. You can find that video and all of our other content right here on the channel. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. We'll see you next time.